My Lords, I'd like to congratulate the Constitution Committee for this excellent report. I'm going to certainly recommend that it's read widely in the public sphere because I think it's important to try and assimilate what happened and learn the lessons. Mind you, before I recommend it's read, I might have to issue a warning because despite my long-standing hostility to Generation Snowflake-like trigger warnings, I have to say that reading the report brought me out in a rash of post-traumatic stress disorder because, all those bad memories that I tried to suppress were brought to the fore, and the horror at the ease with which civil liberties were suspended and the intrusive legislation that transformed the minutiae of everyday life happened, I think, are something I'd rather forget, but we can't forget. The unprecedented attacks on the freedom of ordinary activities for which overnight we needed permission to do anything from walking outside to visiting loved ones in hospital to having a pint with mates is something that actually we don't want to remember but should never ever forget because we should never ever repeat it. I think it has totally discombobulated society, the fact that public life was closed down, and the report reminded me of all those last-minute changes. I do actually remember when the Rule of Six regulations were published only 30 minutes before they became, the law came into force, making it a criminal offence to have 6 people outside gathering, because I was organising to have 6 people outside gathering and I was the 7th and didn't know what to do. There was a kind of sense of confusion and panic. The report notes that 1 in 5 didn't know what tier their area was in. I never understood the tiers. I got completely confused. Only 12% knew the correct amount of time a person was required to self-isolate if you tested positive. 53% didn't know if they were allowed to visit other parts of the UK. All of these things, we all felt disorientated. Family Zoom calls, or maybe it was just my family, were full of angst and arguments about what we were allowed or not allowed to do. In other words, the stuffing was knocked out of spontaneous interactions, and everybody became totally preoccupied with trying to decipher the runes of what we were and were not allowed to do by the law. And this, I think, might not be a constitutional matter, but it matters for the Constitution. That meant that individual agency of grown-up decision-makers and taking responsibility became collateral damage of what this report describes. The confusion and conflation between guidance and law, I think, was particularly damaging, as described in the report. Guidance, guidelines, rules and restrictions were used interchangeably in reference to legal requirements and public health advice. And worse, as the QC Kirsty Primlow rightly notes, we had the added confusion of the police being equally unclear, often acting on the messaging of announcements by the Home Secretary or the Prime Minister at press conferences rather than by the law itself. And to draw out the consequences of some of this, I think this has actually undermined confidence in the police as an impartial body, as a trusted body at actually implementing the law. I actually think it's also undermined trust in the law itself if it can become such a shapeshifter with hardly anybody knowing what it was. I also fear that the use of the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984 to push through so many of the most draconian measures has damaged the reputation of public health advice more generally. One thing the report doesn't note is the use of the behind-the-scenes, behind the backs of the public devices that we use to soften up public opinion in relation to law changes. It's worth reading Laura Dobson's book, State of Fear, which includes the minutes of SAGE meetings and the discussion on the use of behavioural psychology and nudging so that the public would be faced with the worst-case scenarios, i.e. scared enough to comply with behaviour changes backed by legal force. And laws rushed through, justified by fear, obviously leads to a lack of scrutiny, but I do think that it's been bad for the Constitution that we've allowed fear to push through law. Moving on, I agree with the report that the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 with its triple lock would have been a better piece of legislation to use than the Coronavirus Act 2020, which completed its passage through both houses of Parliament in just 3 sitting days. Of course, we all understand that these legal changes were done in the context of the very real and justified sense that this was an unprecedented health emergency at the start of 2020. We do indeed know that. But I'd say it's the job of the government to keep society calm. Hyperactive lawmaking, hyped up by using of fear, I think is the wrong approach. And in fact, it wasn't just the government. I do want to note that Parliament itself, whilst complaining about not having scrutiny over the government, also there were many people in Parliament on all sides who went along with this kind of hyped up, over the top, disproportionate fear-mongering. And I think this in turn created a mood of permanent emergency. Even post the vaccine, the misuse of Section 44R of the Public Health Act, using the urgency clause for which there's no objective definition, created an atmosphere where there was no constraint over what could be done. And it does make me very nervous now when I hear people declaring endless emergencies, the climate emergency, the energy emergency, the cost of a living emergency. You do think, oh my goodness, they're going to bring in emergency legislation for all that, and we'd be locked down for that too. And there are some who are advocating that we do just that. So I'm not just exaggerating. I think there's a good quote in the report from Professor Hickman. Once the true emergency abated, proper legislation should have been put in place. Parliament could and should have insisted on protections such as the ability to amend regulations, but Parliament didn't, and that's what should have happened. To note that with many people, even if it was a minority, were some of us at least, who advocate such an approach at the time, not in the report afterwards, and for doing so were vilified. Lord Sumption was somebody who spoke out very early on, but he was treated as a pariah. I myself, when I arrived in this place, raised certain questions about the legislation, rather anxiously as I was new in lockdown arriving here, and was treated like a wide-eyed loony libertarian for suggesting a sunset clause on certain legislation or for querying things like COVID passports. And in this House, would you believe it, a minister added me to a COVID denial list for raising this, as well as the members of the House of Lords. So you basically felt nervous about raising questions or being critical, not being cynical, but actually being sceptical. There's no mention actually in the report about free speech. And I think you can't have a constitutional report without noting that although there was no laws that were brought in to attack free speech during this time, free speech suffered during this time by behind-the-scenes methods and so on. And I'm really looking forward to at least having a discussion about the new forthcoming Bill of Rights, which apparently is going to put free speech as a core value for society, because we definitely need it to be protected. Moving forward, just and to finish here, this is not over yet by any stretch. I worry that the government have got a taste for the extensive use of secondary legislation and lack of check on executive powers. The new schools bill, which I'm following at the moment, has rightly been criticised as a power grab, to quote the noble Lord Baker, to increase the power of the Secretary of State and the DfE in a way unprecedented since 1870. But I just think that, talking of schools, by the way, it's only now that we're admitting, as the noble Lady Foster has mentioned, the real devastating impact of school closures on young people. And I think that it's that human cost of these constitutional changes that I don't think we should ever forget. I think that it's also interesting to note that at the moment there is a panic about all of those pupils who've not returned to school, which, by the way, might have had something to do with the fact that they were told school wasn't so important after all, because we'd locked the gates on them. Education was a secondary matter. And the government's response to that, the lack of children attending schools, or the increasing non-attendance of children at schools, is to, guess what, bring in illiberal legislation that threatens to fine parents and so on and so forth. So I just worry that the legislative track that we were on isn't over yet. My final point, I say this is the Baroness of Buckley, which is in North Wales. I couldn't but mention something about the impact of the legal divergence between the four parts of the United Kingdom. This whole constitutional decision, I think, to have legal divergence was completely unnecessary and actually created a fragmented mood in the country. there was almost a kind of competitive mood between the different jurisdictions. Mark Drakeford, my very own North Walian leader, wanted to prove that he was harder on lockdown than anyone else, or Nicola Sturgeon competing with the UK government. There was massive arguments in our house about what was an essential good or not, because we lived on either side of the border, 1 mile apart on the English North Wales border. If you went on a train, you were dodging about whether you had your mask on or you're off, as you literally went over the track. I mean, it was ridiculous. And I think that was very bad for scientific advice, because if the Welsh jurisdiction was saying that our science shows this, and 1 mile away the science showed something else, then why would any member of the public trust anything that was proved to be scientific evidence? The whole thing became, to be frank, farcical. So I think that it exacerbated tensions when the country was facing this big challenge. I think it's been hugely bad for the union in general. And as I say, unnecessary. It would be far better to have had a UK-wide response that we all united around. But after all that, I actually hope that there's never a UK-wide response like this again, because I would say never again, and this report gives us ample evidence as to why we should think that.